Thank you to the council for inviting me. I was here in August of last year, and it's a pleasure to be back. And so because the invitation was to talk about platforms, cultural platforms, I thought I would talk about the work that we've been doing in Boston, basically through Pink Comma as a kind of a cultural apparatus that we've initiated through a series of different venues, partly as a way of kind of taking you through sort of what it was for us in Boston, where we were confronted with very similar issues, I think, to some of what's going on here. And where the task for us, that's why I've called the lecture Making a Scene, and I mean it sort of in the double sense of making a scene, making a cultural scene in Boston that we felt didn't really exist. But also, making a scene in the sense of drawing attention to oneself, right, usually in public. That's when somebody says they're making a scene, that's usually what they mean. And sort of what are the tools for doing that, right? So this is almost going to be a kind of nuts and bolts, a series of steps that we followed. Seems like this is sort of not necessary. Steps that we took as young architects and historians and sort of cultural producers in Boston that we felt like there was a certain scene lacking and we wanted to make one. And we've done it primarily through Pink Comma. This is our logo, it's a Pink Comma, which started as an exhibition platform and has since extended into a variety of different venues, and I'll sort of go through them, through some of the things we've done, by no means all. I mean, we've done more than 30 exhibitions since we started in 2007. And the we is me, Chris Grimley, and Mark Pasnick, who among the three of us are trained in architecture, graphic design. I'm an historian who's in a PhD program. And so the idea is that we can sort of cover all the bases in some sense through this venue. All right, so so this is going to be almost a series of steps in a sort of silly way, right? But so the first idea we had was to make space. Literally, I'm not sure whether you can see that, but basically this is Boston. And we wanted a space to talk about things that we felt were sort of under-addressed in the city. And we felt like we were confronted. Boston has a kind of double problem in terms of its cultural platforms if you're a younger architect, and especially a practicing architect. The first problem is, let's say, the academic problem. That in Boston, there's a very strong architecture discourse that revolves around the two poles of Harvard and MIT, Harvard GSD and MIT. And so if you're a student at one of these schools, your cultural discourse as an architect is taken care of in spades. You have lectures, events, exhibitions. There's an enormous amount of cultural production that revolves around the university context, but not really outside of it. These are both based in Cambridge, and if you're in Boston, if you're an architect, there's actually very little for you. And so there's a very strong drop-off. For example, if you're a student, you graduate, you go into a professional office in Boston, there's an immediate drop-off in terms of the kinds of cultural discussions, debates, etc., really that are accessible to you. Everything revolves around the universities, and we felt like we needed to provide something to combat this drop-off for younger architects who, frankly, were bored in Boston and just felt like anything to do with their professional reality as an architect practicing in the city was just not being addressed at all. So we started Pink Comma. So Pink Comma is in Boston, it's in the South End, and it was basically to create a kind of third space as a venue which would not be Harvard, which would not be MIT, and where we could talk about things that we saw as being, in some sense, close to certain kinds of academic interests, but where we wouldn't always have to put it to certain kinds of academic or more theoretical debates. The second problem is more of an historical problem in Boston. That Boston is a very conservative town, or has been very conservative, as a venue for architectural production. And so the image on the right is what people tend to think of. If you say Boston architecture, that's what everybody thinks of. They think it's a brick. It's a kind of traditional brick city, right? This is the image that comes to mind. And we were more interested in this other part of Boston that has been a little bit obscured in the history. And so the image on the left is Boston City Hall, which was built in the 1960s, was a sort of canonical, very famous project when it was built. And it's that part of the history, I mean, we'll get into it more later, but we felt Boston can be somewhat provincial and conservative in its professional culture. And so there's a kind of up and out problem where people very frequently come to the schools, they study at Harvard, they study at MIT, and then as soon as they graduate, they leave. They go to New York or they go to Los Angeles because Boston has not been exciting enough as a venue as a place for architects really to practice in an innovative way and to stay. And so we thought if we provide a space where certain kinds of debates can happen, or where certain kinds of cultural production can take place, that maybe we can help combat that problem, right? And part of it, as you'll see, is to recover the history of moments when Boston really was at the forefront of extremely radical, very innovative practice, and to remind people that that's also a history of the city that people have sort of forgotten about. And so the place where we created the space actually came out of an architecture firm called Over Under. And so Chris and Mark, my two collaborators, are two of the four partners of Over Under. And Pink Comma started really as a space within their space. Literally, you can see the office in the back. And so it started just as a sort of isolation of a chunk of space apart from their office practice where we could do exhibitions. And so it's literally a sort of slot space on the other side of this wall, and it is literally underground. This is our old space. It's underground. It's a kind of underground cultural space in the sense that there are no windows. You have to go downstairs to get there. It was kind of not a great space, but we'll take it. And we did a variety of shows there. And the idea was that the office could function sort of as flex space. So as if we had exhibitions and events that would spill over, that we could just absorb the entire office. This is their old space where we used to do shows, and then we moved. So this is our current space. This is on Waltham Street. And so we're still underground, but we have windows now, so we're very excited. Little tiny windows, but where we can at least project Pink Comma sort of out to the street. And this is a recent show, right? So the first act was really just taking a portion of space and saying, we're going to use this. And really the decision that was made, the number one fundamental decision was that the one thing we would not use this space for was to promote the work of Over Under, right? So it was people who run an office taking a portion of their real estate and saying, we want to have other conversations and we actually want to keep them separate. We want to be able to have cultural discussions that are not going to be seen as simply promoting the work of this office, but where we want to have a broader cultural or historical sort of discussion. So the next step was to make friends, right? Sort of make a network of people that we wanted to talk about and sort of talk with and have conversations with in the city. And we started this through an initiative in 2008 called Young Architects Boston, where we decided to put together a group of 10 offices that we saw ourselves as being sort of generationally related to, and put them all together and just say there is a scene of young emerging architects and nobody's ever really put them together and tried to talk about them as a group. I mean, it's a kind of generational branding exercise, and we wanted to do an exhibition of this group and find certain sorts of groupings or continuities across their work. And the thing that this was all sort of hinged on was the Boston annual meeting of the American Institute of Architects, which is the national organization. And we organized an installation, this is called Party Wall Hanging Green, with these 10 architects. So these 10 firms worked collaboratively to produce this kind of pixelated wall of hanging green stuff as a kind of artificial nature. This is across the street from our old gallery space. And we used the occasion basically to form a kind of mega office out of these 10 offices and then produce an exhibition of their work and of them as a generation that would be the counterpart to this, right? This is all of them putting it together in the parking lot across the street. And so when we did the exhibition, we were interested in maintaining this sense of anonymity, a sense of the group, that we would always emphasize the community rather than turning it into a kind of portfolio exhibition of the individual offices. And the way we did it was by neutralizing all of the projects and the images that we showed into this grid, where the grid was completely mixed. Projects were not grouped by office. They were actually just sort of randomly mixed or grouped in other ways, either by type or by formal language or by material, where you can see the images sometimes sort of cross through many panels of the grid. Sometimes it's just one. And all the information on the individual offices was sort of suppressed underneath. So these images are all on felt panels, which you had to peel away. You had to look underneath these panels in order to figure out who was doing what project, right? So it was more about the body of work across a community than it was really about promoting any of the specific offices. And then we supplemented it with a survey project. We compiled sort of data graphics that we designed to try to talk about the conditions of practice in Boston for these architects. How big are their offices? Where do they work? what software do they use? So there's the PC guy and the Mac guy, or the two. What's the gender composition of the office? Sort of basically trying to describe what are the realities if you are a young professional office in Boston, what's good about it, what's bad about it, what works and what doesn't. And then we continued this initiative 2 years later. We came on the 2-year anniversary of Young Architects Boston, and we thought, you know, we should make this into a biennial. And it's partly, again, because we felt like we were competing with cities like New York, for example, that already have a very strong structure of biennials and award programs for young designers. There's a system to validate and promote younger architects in a way that Boston, strangely enough, has been lacking. And so we got fed up with the fact that nobody else was doing it, and we just decided we'll do it ourselves. So we decided we copyrighted a biennial, and we organized it more systematically with a jury and an official and anonymous selection procedure, et cetera. So we set up the formal apparatus for a biennial, but we continued a lot of the project of the Young Architects Boston. So I don't know if you could see on the right. Again, we mixed all the projects of the 5 winners that we selected, and we pushed all of their information to these takeaway sort of information sheets that you would have to take and use as a guide to figure out whose project was whose. Again, we sort of weren't interested just in focusing on the individual office, but rather on the whole. And the latest outcome of this, which is on exhibit now, we've also been in the last year the curators of the Boston Society of Architects exhibition space, which is a new exhibition space that started a year ago, February of last year, and is a kind of second cultural platform for architects in Boston. And when they opened, they looked to us because we had already gone through a lot of the problems that they were going to be facing. They had a new gallery space, which is this, and they didn't, in a way, know how to have a certain kind of conversation within the city, and so they came to us. We had done, a couple of dozen shows at that point, and they wanted us to really help them have that discussion. And so, among other things, we said, well, we've started a biennial. We'd like to do it at your space. And so now the biennial is going to happen at the Boston Society of Architects. And we carried through the same project. So we structured the biennial, this is the 3rd one, after 6 years. We structured it around the idea of an archive of the previous 6 years, where we would have new winners, but we would also basically describe our project over the last 6 years. Sort of hard to see. And so the 4 winners each developed a site-specific installation so that there would be some kind of atmospheric presence of these offices. Right, so this is one of them. Each of the 4 represented for us a particular theme, a kind of cultural, let's say discursive theme in architecture that became the organizing structure of the entire exhibit. So for example, Rorschach, which is a kind of projection of images collaged together sort of randomly from sites like Architizer and Dezeen, images of architectural tropes, essentially, sort of collaged together into something like the Rorschach ink blots that you would take in a psychiatrist's office in the 1950s to kind of unpack the psychology of formal tropes that circulate very heavily in architecture. This, for us, represented the theme of culture, sort of the discourse of architecture. An installation, a spiral stair. There was an exploration of geometry of spiral stairs in concrete that for us was really to do with the notion of discipline, of a kind of technique, material technique at the core of the discipline. This is by Matter Design, Brandon Clifford, who teaches at MIT. Material was the 3rd theme. This is an office called Ground View, which is a landscape office that did an installation of granite blocks that were sort of from a quarry locally in Massachusetts, and they were very interested in the material character of this granite. And so these are blocks that will eventually be used in projects, not by them, but they could sort of capture these granite slabs in transit, as it were, and display them in different states, sort of granite, gravel, slabs, sort of different consistencies of the material sort of influx. And then type. This is Kyle Moe's. This is a project called Stackhouse, which is part of an ongoing series of typological and material exercises in sustainable houses, essentially, and how you can use the captured thermal energy of a very simple wood frame to basically make houses function climatically where you don't need all sorts of technical apparatus. And so then these 4 the themes that we extracted from these installations became really the organizing structure for the archive as a way for us to retroactively understand the work that we had been cataloging through the biennial over the last 6 years. And so we developed a structure where each of these 4 themes would be assigned in a way as tags to the different projects, and so different projects would be affiliated to one or more of these themes, and we would use an archive to connect these. So each one of these is a project, and each one of them would be connected to each other through a system of cross-referencing. And so the archive functioned like a filing system. It's like a sort of poster hanging rack, where each entry into the card catalog was sort of interactive and would have one project and then would have information graphics on the back, and was connected to these filing cabinets. And so the projects are also cross-referenced to these filing cabinets where you can get more detailed information sort of on each of them. And now this archive is being published as a book that went to press yesterday, and hopefully will be sort of done later. Okay, so that's sort of the contemporary project, which was basically to make a context of friends, colleagues, collaborators that were interested in the sorts of conversations we were interested in, and to identify them and come up with, find a platform to recognize all of them. But another part of this for us has been an historical project. It's essentially to try to retell the history of the city in a way that we're interested in. I'm from Boston. Chris is from Toronto. Mark is from New Jersey. They both came to Boston and were very interested in living there and have been living there now for about 15 years. And we all felt that Boston was a much more interesting city than any of the narratives that were being told about it. The narrative of Boston as a kind of conservative brick city didn't really fit with us. And we wondered sort of what happened to histories that have been either forgotten or that are not considered to be properly part of the city, that are treated as if there's something alien. And so a large part of the projects that we do at Pink Comma are historical research and basically building up an archive of sort of presenting the city as the more radical, innovative place that we think of it as having been, and having to identify basically projects that have been almost lost on the historical record. So one project we've been working on, this is an ongoing project called Heroic, and it's basically about brutalism. It's the history of brutalism broadly, but also specifically in Boston from about 1960 to 1976, when Boston really was Boston was really at the forefront of architectural production in the U.S. In those decades. All of the most famous international architects were building in Boston, and they were building very heavily in concrete. Brutalist concrete was the preferred language. Many of the most outstanding examples of that period are in Boston. Boston is a very small footprint, and it has an extraordinarily high number of these buildings, many of which are still in a very good condition. It's one of the centers of urban renewal and the urban renewal history in Boston, in the U.S. in those decades. And we wanted to recover the period when Boston was really at the center of this kind of production. And if you were a radical, innovative architect, Boston was where you wanted to practice, right? And also, it was a moment when designers had a stronger voice in the city. And there were institutional authorities like the Boston Redevelopment Authority that really looked to architects as people that could make a contribution to a certain vision of what the city would be like. And we felt like this had also been lost. And so part of identifying a certain voice for contemporary practitioners for us has been to go back to previous historical moments when that has been the case, so that we can then go back to the BRA or go back to other authorities and say, why is it not like this anymore? What happened, in a way? Why do architects no longer have a voice? And so I should say the reason it's called Heroic was that we decided first that if we were going to do a project about brutalism, that we couldn't call it brutalism. We couldn't use the term because we felt that brutalist architecture and brutalism as a term has become heavily overburdened. It has a lot of baggage. It's a term that tends to end the discussion before it begins, right? Brutal sounds bad. And we decided we were just going to relabel all the architecture of this period, and we were going to call these heroic buildings instead of brutal, right? Brutal came out of a certain historical moment. We didn't want to engage with the initial reasons why that term was used, given that it's been so distorted and altered and debased. And if you say the term brutal now, people think that this architecture must have been designed with bad intentions. It was designed to be inhumane or oppressive. And it's actually very much not the case. These buildings were well loved when they were built. And we decided to call them heroic to sort of recapture some of that energy. And so this has taken on a variety of different means. So this is an ongoing archival project that we conduct, sort of the three of us in the office. Stage one has been mapping all of these concrete buildings that were built in the period in Boston. There's something like 200. We have a database of all of them. Photographing all of them in a consistent way. These are all Mark Pasnick's photographs to try to kind of recapture some of the formal qualities of these things, many of which have deteriorated, some of which do not have not been maintained nearly as well. Sorry, this is a little bit unclear, but also to do consistent drawings of each one of them where we can understand how does the facade system work, what are their formal qualities, what's consistent across all of these buildings, etc., what varies aesthetically, etc. So building up a database of documentation. And finally channeling this into a series of what started as exhibitions and has since gotten into other venues. So the first round of the kind of publishing heroic publicly was an exhibition at our gallery that was organized as a series of archival sheets. And so each one of these, you can see these sheets are hanging on hooks with multiple copies. And it was designed as a kind of takeaway exhibition. So people would come, compile a set of this archive, and then take it off with them, somewhere. And the idea was that this could show up at a bar, or it could show up on the subway, or somebody could take it to a restaurant, and that the exhibition could travel outside of the gallery itself, because we wanted to produce a public discussion about these buildings and what they meant for people that are surrounded by them every day but don't think about them. And then continuing that public discussion through other venues. So we have a web archive. You can go online. If you search for Heroic Project, you'll get our online archive of these buildings, which we're building up, having a presence on Twitter, etc., to basically precipitate a kind of public discussion around, to try to reopen the history of these buildings. And then a further extension of our interest largely in the same period, but trying to bring it up to the present, this is actually the inaugural exhibition at the Boston Society of Architects that we did when they opened their gallery space. It's called Inform, Communicating Boston. And it's a kind of micro history of the last 50 years of Boston as a kind of home for radical architecture. Again, not the way that people think about it all the time. And we isolated 5 projects from starting in 1965, coming up all the way through to the present, that really represented for us moments when architects tried to design buildings or public projects, very heavily public projects in Boston, that tried to make the city more accessible and more legible to people that would use it. In a way, each of these projects, we felt tried to narrate the city and its history and its use to the public, to citizens of the city, to people that would use it on a day-to-day basis. And so the first project, I'll just go through all 5 of them very briefly. The first project for us was the modernization of the subway system, of the MBTA in the 60s. This was the first modernization of this type in North America that would use Helvetica, for example, that had a consistent wayfinding and signage throughout the entire system, a massive program of building new stations. This was prior, for example, to the Massimo Vignelli project in New York, as a kind of graphic project where the idea was that you had to make the subway system more usable, more legible, and more accessible to people that navigated what is otherwise a very confusing city geographically every day, as a way of making the city more open. And so then in the exhibition, we tried to recover some of the graphics that were being circulated at the time, right? There's it's called the T in Boston, the subway. There's a new T coming your way. Reproduce the graphics. We built a very large model of the pilot station for this modernization program, Arlington Station in 1965, with the original graphics. And we had to reconstruct the original graphics. There's very little documentation of these things as they would have looked in this station. You can see the train sort of flying out. An experimental information center, 1969, which was a kind of cybernetic info center that was built as a prototype for sort of user testing for 1 month in the summer of 1969, and was a series of inflatables on top of tubes which had all sorts of information apparatus. There was a movie tube, there was a telephone where you could call and get information about the city. This was sort of information feedback loops that would direct you to how to use the city circa 1969, which we just thought was fabulous. And it was built, the idea was that this would be built at major intersections throughout the city, and that this was a kind of prototype to record user feedback. There was a news ticker, it was a sort of very complex project. And again, we tried in the exhibition to kind of to reconstruct this. There's even less documentation of this. But we were able, from photographs essentially, to reconstruct the design of this experimental information center. And so partly, for us, the way of making this kind of history active in the present was basically to materialize it, to materialize things which, unless you're looking in an archive, you will never see, and if you see them, will only exist in photographs, and to kind of put them back in the space of the present for people. You know, we were hoping for the reaction that people would come see this exhibition and they would say, I had no idea that these projects had ever existed. And sure enough, that's largely what happened. Anyways, a pavilion called Where's Boston from 1975, which was a kind of public exhibition, a kind of tent that housed an auditorium that had a multimedia slide projection. This was in conjunction with the biennial, the US bicentennial in 1976, that would narrate the story of Boston in a kind of ethnographic way and its neighborhoods to people that lived in the city, but also for tourists. Where we tried to kind of reconstruct, basically to sort of replay the size and the scale of this pavilion at something like human scale, but also to reconstruct something of the character of this multimedia slideshow by using, these are telex machines, which are essentially like TVs for slides with slide carousels on top of it, where you had to source these machines that nobody's seen since the 70s so that people could press the button and basically so this recreates both the history of the building and its design and its construction, but also the slideshow that would have existed sort of inside that. A project called Interim Bridges Project by Kennedy and Violich Architecture in the 90s, which was the thing you see at the top of the image is the Central Artery, which is this very large highway, steel triple-deck highway that ran straight through the downtown that was part of this urban renewal history of the city, and which was being slated for demolition in the 1990s. And Kennedy and Violich proposed a series of temporary bridges that would cross over the trench during the construction of the underground tunnels that would replace the Big Dig. But these underground trenches were also the sites of archaeological excavations into the history of the city. You're required to do archaeological digs when you dig up something in the downtown of Boston because you find things from 200 years ago that would be basically public exhibition sites. They built one of them. Open, 24 hours, public exhibition sites on the archaeological history of Boston and its infrastructures. Where we sort of brought out of storage models that they had made of this layering that were 20 years old and sort of had these models rebuilt, essentially as themselves sort of archival, sort of almost archaeological objects in themselves, right? And then finally, to bring it up to the present, a project by an office called Landing Studio, which is both architecture and landscape, at the Chelsea Salt Terminals, which is this is the node that receives salt, road salt that's sprinkled on the roads in the winter to clear the roads from snow, from all over the world, and is received on this salt pile in Chelsea, which is seen as a kind of ugly industrial site in the neighborhood, but which Landing Studio thought was very beautiful, and which they wanted to make it legible to the community around it, what it was and what was its role within this world economy of salt, and how was it a node that was actually extremely necessary to distribute salt all over Massachusetts in order to basically let the state function during the winter. And they took it almost as a public art project of how do you make an infrastructural industrial site into a monument, into a kind of urban monument. And they did it originally through a series of projections where they developed a series of sort of text messages that they would project onto this site to turn it into a kind of almost Jenny Holzer sort of art piece. And so in the exhibition, it's sort of washed out, but we just reconstructed it. We worked with them to build a salt pile in the space. So this is salt from the Chelsea terminal built in the space of the exhibition, where we redid the projections on the surface of this, and then the back of this was a huge information wall that described basically how salt flows all over the world, how it comes to the site, etc. And so crowds from Chelsea would be brought over to see this, right? And then the last part, a related exhibition we did called Futures, was on the history of a very specific project, a megastructure project to design an entirely new sector of the city that would have been built something like the Montreal Expo in '67. This would have been built to coincide with the bicentennial in 1976. This was proposed around 1969, and was shocking to us when we discovered that this is like the Tokyo Bay sort of Kenzotange megastructure, the kind of metabolist metastructure, that this was a serious proposal in Boston to design a completely new area, basically like a kind of third downtown with housing, parks, public recreation, exhibition spaces, etc. And it was not a hypothetical project. This was funded, this was presented to a national commission. It was a very live project. It was sabotaged by very particular provincial politics, but it was very nearly built as a kind of other history for what Boston could have been. And so the exhibition reconstructed a political timeline of the history of this project, from its origins through to its design, through the public debates. We found all of the Boston Globe articles where all the politics are getting hashed out. And so this is a chronological timeline where we tried to basically display this sort of archive of how it was envisioned to sort of modify the city. And then the last part, the last thing I'll talk about sort of in this process is basically making news. And for us, it really has to do with print, sort of taking the exhibition into the space of print as another way of finding out how do you conduct this sort of platform through the physical space of an exhibition, and then how do you find ways of having it disseminate, and what is the role of print sort of in that process, and sort of by us, but also not by us. And so on the simplest level, we wanted these exhibitions to produce a certain public discussion in Boston, and for us, the proof was whether we would get articles in the Boston Globe, for example, whether we really could produce it. And for example, when we did the Heroic show, we were very happy to see that it did start to generate these sort of articles. So the one on the right is by us in an architecture magazine called Tough Love in Defense of Brutalism. But the other two are from the Boston Globe as sort of eddies that would swirl off of the exhibitions that we'd produced, right? In praise of ugly buildings or the beauty of concrete, where we could start to basically put these things back on the map for people. And for us, we needed these things as proof that our attempt to establish a platform really was working. Or other cases where we decided quite explicitly that the city needed to be having a certain conversation about something that we thought was urgent and was happening, and we needed to kind of gather all that discussion into one place. So for example, bicycles. Bicycling is a huge issue now in Boston, increasingly in Washington, D.C., in New York, that are instituting bike share systems. Biking is sort of taking over the culture of these cities and really reformatting what is the role of the car, how do people commute, what does it mean about the relationship between live and work, etc. But we thought there's no consensus on sort of what these things mean, and rather than making a certain statement about a consensus, we should just open a space where people can talk about it. So we did an exhibition called Let's Talk About Bikes. Let's talk about what they mean, who's in favor of it. We did user surveys to find out, which do people who drive cars hate the cyclists? Do the cyclists hate the people in the cars? Sort of where is it all headed? What does it all mean for the future of the city? And this was going on at the same time as the Inform exhibition, and we just laid this exhibition basically sort of on top of the existing show with data graphics and sort of bubbles on the floor, and then bicycles sort of hanging all this through the space as sort of graphics. And again, we were very happy to see the immediate uptake that it did. It crystallized something for people in Boston that were looking for a framework to talk about these issues, to be able to talk about biking and what it meant, right? So this is the magazine of the Boston Globe. So for us, it's been important to try to kind of generate this sort of ricochet effects of the work that we do. And then our proudest moment, or at least my proudest moment, was having done the Futures exhibition and tried to reactivate the history of this project, to pose the question of, why is planning, city planning, urban planning in Boston so timid nowadays compared to the kind of radical vision of this sort of megastructure in the 1960s? Sort of what happened? was to be able to get out of it sort of an interest from the Boston Globe to do a multi-page article about the lost island of Boston and you know, to say a lot of the things that we wanted to say, but sort of, you know, we could only go so far through our exhibition, and they were willing to carry it the next step for us and have, right, how a never built floating neighborhood could spark our ambitions for Boston's future. And so people were very willing to take up this sort of discussion. And then the last part of it is also our own interest in producing publications ourselves and to constantly migrate between the territory of the exhibition, the web platform, for example, and the space of print as things that sort of swirl around each other and each have different roles. My background prior to this curatorial work is as a publisher, and we've been very interested in the history of how architects publish, how architects have functioned as much through books and through being authors, being editors, editing journals, editing magazines, producing books as a kind of discursive production in parallel with their building production, and that they're just part and parcel of the same operation. And that we consider this to be as much a part of how architects work as what one thinks of as the kind of proper territory of building project. And so one of the first exhibitions we did at Pinkama was a history of how architects have operated as publishers over the last 100 years, called Publishing Practices. And we conducted a survey of about 500 people that were trained formally as architects all over the world, and asked them, for example, what books do you read? What is your top 5 list of books that were formative for you in your formation as an architect? And then we did, so this is a chronology, this is a timeline of all those books. It's like a city made out of books. And the number, you know, the height of each bar is the number of times each book was listed. And so it was a way of letting people tell us basically which books have been the canonical books in their generation. It goes up to 2010, which was right after we did the exhibition. And I'll let you guess which book has the tall spike from 1995. And we found out that there's a certain periodicity to books which really suddenly caught fire and sort of had a massive uptake within the field, right? This is about sort of, if you took a slice across the discipline at any given moment in particular locations, would people be reading the same books? And also it was to pose the question, what is the role of print now? Just to give you a sort of character of that. What is the role of print now? Is this ever going to happen again? The way that you get this sort of spike, this is SMLXL, by the way, in case you couldn't guess. What is the role of the book in the future? And so this survey also asked questions like, sort of how do you primarily read architecture books? Do you consider book production to be an equally valid form of architectural production? Where do you get your architectural information from these days? Is it any longer the book? And then what will happen to books in the future? Will you keep reading them? And then out of this survey, we produced case studies of 10 canonical books that were really the spikes in this survey, and looked at the books themselves, their graphic character, their content, how they were developed, but also what were the formative models for each one of these books, how is that sort of channeled into the book itself, and then what were the sort of after products of these books as the authors then went on to develop further publications, etc. And so it's about how the discourse flows through these particular examples. And then we continued it 2 years later in an exhibition called Newsstand, where we became very interested in the broadsheet in the newspaper as a format. And this is part of an ongoing series of exhibitions on formats. And it came out of an invitation to work on a project called the New City Reader. This was at the New Museum in New York. This was Kazis Varnelis and Joseph Garima had asked. We're developing an ongoing weekly newspaper that would get produced as part of an exhibition at the New Museum called The Last Newspaper. And it was an exhibition about the newspaper as a medium within art and architectural production since the 1970s. And the New City Reader was a kind of installation of an office within, so this is the exhibition space within the New Museum. And the New City Reader was basically an editorial team that would actually work out of this exhibition space and invite in a different team of guest editors to do each week the different sections of a kind of traditional newspaper, right? So 1 week would be sports, 1 week would be food, 1 week would be style, 1 week would be obituaries. And Pink Comma was part of a team of people that were asked to do the very last week in this series as basically the back end of the newspaper, which was the classified ads, the advertisements, which would now be taken up on Craigslist or online or something. But this is ours. This is the classified section, which I won't go into. But for us, we had a certain criticism of the show at the New Museum. We basically rejected the premise of the exhibition, this exhibition within which the New City Reader sat, called The Last Newspaper, because we didn't like the implication that the newspaper was a dead format, right? That we were sort of at the last newspaper, and that we were almost being nostalgic for this traditional format as a thing which was dying and which was never to return. Because at the same time, we had a lot of friends in the architecture world that in the previous 2 or 3 years had become extremely heavily invested in using newspapers as a way of disseminating information because it was cheap and it was quick and you could produce a lot of copies and you could get them distributed very widely. It sort of didn't have, it was easier to do than books, right? You could do them very quickly. You could work with a printer in Queens that most of these guys worked with, where you could basically go to press in 3 or 4 days. And you could get, thousands of copies for very little money, and you could circulate them in a much more ephemeral way. And so we thought we would do a sort of counter exhibition at our gallery where we would compile, I think we had about 30 examples of newspapers and broadsheets and other ephemeral formats that were being produced by friends of ours all over the US, and we had a few from Europe also. Basically to make the claim that the newspaper actually was becoming an increasingly robust format. It was not dead at all. And it was a takeaway show, right? So it was just stacks of these things. And so this was a kind of trading center. People could come, people could bring their newspapers, people could also take. The idea was that the exhibition would disappear by the end of it because all the copies would be gone. And we also, of course, produced our own newspaper as part of it, which was the catalog for this show, which would describe the techniques of each one of these examples, how it was produced, what was the cost per issue, how many copies were printed, who printed it, why. We asked them questions again about why the newspaper, why were they invested in that format. And then we used this as the build-up to our classifieds issue by having a classified section in our own newspaper that people could fill out during the exhibition, and the data from that was what we used actually to do the classifieds a couple of months later when we got to New York. And since then, it's become really a format that we've used ourselves. So we've pushed all of our exhibitions into the space of these kinds of broadsheets. And so every exhibition we've done at the Boston Society of Architects, for example, Inform, we produce newspapers. And it's a little bit an extension of the kind of thing we were trying to do in Heroic, where we were very big on the idea that the exhibition could travel freely and widely outside of the space of the gallery itself by just letting this stuff kind of circulate. Right, so we did it for Inform. We also did it for the biennial again. And in this case, the publication itself was a component of the exhibition. It wasn't just a takeaway. These were hanging on hooks, and you had to actually take them in order to navigate the space of the exhibition and to navigate the archive in some sense. So this became a sort of guide. And then the last step of this is to channel these kinds of initiatives more into sort of the, let's say, traditional space of publication. This is a small publication we did of the biennial in 2010, and we're now publishing the archive of the last 6 years of the biennial in a book that's called Archive. This is the one that went to press yesterday and hopefully will exist by the time I get back to Boston. And so that's it. So that's sort of the way that we've tried through all of these different means to make a space where we can exist as designers, as architects, as historians, as researchers in Boston in a kind of local way that would really speak about the scene that we're a part of, that we felt didn't exist. We think that it exists more now because we've been doing these sorts of initiatives, rather than the constant sort of looking outwards of people that are trained in Boston and then sort of go elsewhere. But we wanted to try to preserve some of that intelligence and that activity and that innovation for the city itself so that it could really be a home for architects and designers in the future. Thanks.